And he goes out to visit his frontier properties, and he's already afraid that the West is going to be lost. And he has he has little properties all around that he's picked up over time as a surveyor, but he's got 3 major properties on the other side of the Appalachians. And he gets to the first one, which is up near what's now Pittsburgh. And he's got a ne'er-do-well of a person running the place, who is just cheating him right and left. Cheating him just right and left. During the Revolution, he keeps asking for money to build this mill to make the area successful. He gets out and sees this enormous mill, largest mill, one of the largest mills in America, but it's built so it can't run. It doesn't have any water to run. You know, it's a big mill that used a lot of money, and he was embezzling off Washington. But it's a totally worthless mill, and the tenants aren't paying. And then he tries to go to his second place, and I'm going to read a little bit about that. And it's been occupied by a religious group that has moved out there, and they won't pay him. They won't pay him at all. They claim it's their property. And then the third piece of property he can't even get to because the Native Americans have moved back into that area, and they're waiting, he's warned, to capture him. And so he doesn't. He first asks for troops, but there are no troops to help him get there, so he doesn't go to it's his largest property. And his agent, his earlier agent, William Crawford, had been captured by the Indians a year before, and he had been, or 2 years before, and he had been scalped, and then you don't die from a scalping, and then roasted alive, and killed. And so Washington decides he's not going to go there. But he realizes the frontier has to be brought into the connection. And he sees these people, and they don't care a twit who he is, and they don't care a twit about America. And their goods are going to have to go to market, he figures, either up through the St. Lawrence or down the Mississippi. So they're going to align, and their ties are going to follow their alliances. So they're going to align with the Brits up in Canada, or they're going to align with the Spanish down in New Mexico, in New Orleans, and they're going to actually realign. Vermont at this time is actively conspiring with the British to leave the Union and join British Canada. And so he says this area's got to be connected. So he pushes this idea of building a canal across from the Potomac up to the Ohio River. Eventually, the successful one, he gets it built, but a more successful one is built, of course, the Erie Canal, to connect the West, because there were no railroads, connect the West to get commerce out. So he goes back, he comes back, and rather than go back with his group, because he came out with some friends and some aides, and they had a big caravan going across on the normal road. He goes back on his own. He just goes back alone on a horseback, trying to figure out where the rivers are so he can try to build a canal. And so he's riding around, coming back for weeks through areas of the Shenandoah, Virginia that nobody's living. Occasionally he runs in a settler's cabin and he knocks on the door to stay, and imagine they're surprised to see George Washington standing there. Other nights he just camps out. It's pouring down rain sometimes. He's just sleeping under his coat with his horse. Riding down rapids and rivers when he's working on this, he loves to ride down rapids. I mean, he always takes his fishing poles. He loves to fish. This is a side of Washington you just don't hear about. And I got to work on that period in his life. Got to learn the weirdest things, like, he has terrible trouble with his false teeth, of course, and everybody talks about his wooden teeth. He did not have wooden teeth. No matter what people tell you, he didn't have wooden teeth. I've seen 17 pairs of his teeth, and he has 2 types of teeth. He has teeth that, most of his teeth are walrus tusks, from ivory, from walrus tusk. And walrus tusk Washington, whatever you think, he's an incredibly social person. He loves going to balls, he loves going hunting, he loves going fishing with people, he loves parties. He goes to parties all the time, and and back then the drink of pleasure was tea. And he drank this, I don't know how he could sleep at night. They'd done some tea he'd drink every day. I think he'd be up all night going to the bathroom. And of course then he had to go outside to go to the bathroom. And Irish, the tusks take up the teeth stain. And so his teeth look like wood because they were brown. But he also had other teeth that were made from human teeth. Those were the interesting ones, which I was able to discover during that time. I mean, I didn't discover it. People knew he had teeth made of human teeth, but I figured out how he did it exactly by my research while I was back there, because I could, look at anything and go through his stuff and try to trace down leads. And he had this is not a nice story, I guess. but it's a true story. During the Revolution, there was when the French troops were with him, he had a dentist that came over with the French troops who had developed the technique of transplanting teeth. And what you do is when you're having a tooth pulled, he would get some volunteer who was paid, sit next to him, poor person, and then he'd yank the equivalent tooth from the poor person and put it into the hole and socket, and then he'd wrap it together. And it actually worked about half the time. And so he stayed after the Revolution and tried to make money in America, and he was an itinerant dentist going around offering tooth transplants. And I figured out that he was at Mount Vernon 3 times, because Washington had met him during the Revolution. Washington had him at Mount Vernon. He stayed for one time for 2 months, the other time for a few weeks. And he tried to work on Washington's teeth. Well, Washington, so I'll ask you, where do you think Washington's going to get those teeth? You're absolutely right. That's where he got the teeth. Now, the trouble was, none of them worked on Washington because he didn't have a fresh hole. Washington had already lost all but one tooth. He only had one of his own teeth. And his dentures are interesting because they have a hole where the one tooth is. That anchored the rest. And that's why he was never a very good public speaker, because he only had that one anchor up at top, and the teeth didn't stay in very well. So he wasn't a good public speaker, but he was a brilliant letter writer, and he was a wonderful one-on-one course. People loved talking to him. He was a great conversationalist, where he didn't have to speak before a group. But what he did is, the teeth didn't take from the slaves, but he made them into dentures. So he had a couple pairs of dentures made from teeth extracted, I believe, from his slaves. The reason why I believe they came as slaves is because that was my first guess too. So I started looking. They have all the financial records, and I found during the period when the dentist was staying there, I could coincide. Here's when the dentist here. So I look at the financial records at Mount Vernon for the same time, and I found out that he was paying 17 shillings a tooth to his slaves for the teeth. Now I figured, maybe they're doing it voluntarily. He's paying them. He's not just taking them. 17 shillings. Well, is that a lot of money back then? So I had another idea. It says, well, I bet you while the dentist is there, he's also probably doing it for other people. So I looked in the local newspaper, the Alexandria newspaper, and I did some ads for La Professor Moliere. I'm trying to think. It's in the book. Moliere, I guess it'd be pronounced Moliere. Moliere is doing teeth transplants. We'll work on your teeth. And so I figured, well, where's he getting the teeth? So I looked and found classified ads where anybody who's willing to contribute a tooth for Professor Moliere, he was paying 42 shillings. So I figured out the free market price of a tooth. Now, I don't know if anybody accepted the 42, but that's what he was offering for teeth. So I figured the free market price was 42, and 17 shillings is about 42% of it? So he was getting a good deal from the slaves. I don't know whether they were voluntary or not. But you learn a lot of things about George Washington. He never wore a tri-corner hat, no matter the pictures. They're bi-corner hats that he would wear sometimes. But this was a period when, since he wasn't in, political power, he could be himself. And as I say, he loved parties, he loved dances. What was he doing with religion? We get that there are people who write that America was founded as a Christian nation. You probably hear that. You have that picture you see all over the place of Washington praying at Mount Vernon. I mean, not praying at Valley Forge, by his horse, and he's down on his knees. Washington had been religious. Well, no, he had gone to church. Let me rephrase that. I don't know how religious he was. It wasn't the period I was studying. Before the Revolution. Before the Revolution, he was trying to establish himself in Virginia. He'd married well. He got the plantation. He had married well. He contributed. He was always a politician. He served in the House of Burgesses. He ran for election, campaigned hard. Did the typical campaigning back then, which was mostly getting voters drunk by giving them a lot of liquor on election day. And he won. And he was a member of the 2 local churches. Episcopalian, well, Anglican. He was never part of the Baptist. Baptists were growing, the Great Awakening was going on. He was never touched by any of that movement at all. And he was a member both of the local parish, the one that Mount Vernon was in, and he also was a member in Alexandria, the nearest city, and back then Alexandria would have been the city for that area of Virginia. It's where all their goods went to market through. There was no Washington, D.C. across the way. It was the furthest up the Potomac you could go, so that's why so it served that whole area. Lovely town with large mansions and many, many warehouses. And it had a big, big cathedral, almost church. It wasn't cathedral because, of course, there was no bishop in America. And he had a pew. He paid for a pew in both places, a very nice pew. And he would go. During the Revolutionary War, but you don't know on what basis he's going. He's part of this society, and he's trying to build, and he's trying to get elected and political. During the Revolution, he stopped going to church altogether. Never goes to church during the Revolution, except on a couple ceremonial occasions. He does not go to church. When he comes back, the first thing he does upon getting back to Mount Vernon after the Revolution is he resigns from the vestry at the local parish. He'd always been on the vestry, even through the Revolution. He was officially a member of the vestry. He resigns, first thing he does. And he really never again goes to church. His wife would go, but he never went to church. He never celebrated Christmas again. His wife would go out. He would not go to church on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, for example. When he would be, later, when he's president, he does go to church when he's president. But he always makes a point of leaving before communion. He will not take communion anymore. He never takes communion again. He makes a visible point of leaving before communion. Martha would stay for communion. The preacher at the church but when he was president, he did go. When he comes back, he never goes to church again. It becomes a formality, and his preacher always thought that his preacher was the preacher at that church, Bishop White, who's very important, his brother-in-law of Robert Morris, the richest man in America, America's first bishop, a close personal friend of Washington. As a church, they were close personal. He was the chaplain for the Continental Congress when Washington was in the Continental Congress. Very established person, and Washington goes to his church, Christ Church in Philadelphia, when he's president. But again, he always leaves before communion, and Bishop White says that he did not think that Washington believed in any of the doctrines of Christianity. He didn't believe in Christ, in short. And that seems to be what most scholars conclude. He was always very private about his religious beliefs. The only time he only goes to church 2 times during when he's in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Remember, the Constitutional Convention lasts for 3.5 months. They're sweating away. And during that time, he only goes to church twice, and I think they're both revealing. The one time he goes is when Bishop White comes back from England. Bishop White, the British had never allowed it to be any Anglican bishops in the New World, because they thought that way they would lose the New World if they had their own bishops. And so they never allowed a bishop, and they never allowed a bishop for 9 years. And 9 years after the Revolution, they allowed to make a bishop, and it's White. It's White. He'd been the local, very popular local minister, very wealthy, connected. And so Bishop White comes back from England after having been made a bishop, and they have a big ceremony, church ceremony, and Washington goes to that. Well, that makes sense, because he's living at the home of Robert Morris, White's brother-in-law, and they were very close friends from the past. And he's not certainly not a evangelical person at all, Bishop White. And he was now an American bishop, and so Washington goes to that. The only other time, and I think this is very revealing, the only other time he goes to church was he was elected as president of the Constitutional Convention on a Friday. And that means he's the most important person. And on that Sunday, he goes to Catholic Mass. He had never been to a Catholic Mass in his life. He never went to one again. The Catholics were a very oppressed minority in most of the United States. They were illegal in New York. They were illegal in Massachusetts. They never had a Mass. But Pennsylvania was always more open to diverse religious ideas. It was founded by the Quakers, and it was always more open. They lived some in Baltimore. But the Catholics were a very oppressed minority. And Washington chooses to go to a Catholic church, Catholic Mass. And it's front page news throughout America. George Washington had gone to a Catholic Mass. Now, I think what he was doing is just showing America's going to be different. It's a political statement. And John Adams, who always was jealous of everybody, John Adams was walking jealousy. He thought he was the greatest man in the world and hated anybody else for getting attention. And he, as vice president, saw Washington up close, and he said that Washington was the greatest political actor he'd ever seen in his life. Because, he just acted. And that if this Constitution works, I'm now president. If this Constitution works, it's going to be open to diverse religious ideas. You Catholics can have a safety and a home under our regime. I think it's a political statement because he never showed. You couldn't go to a Catholic church in Virginia because it was illegal. And here he went to this Catholic church, front page news. I think that's the sort of story that he's trying to tell. And I'd never seen, nobody had ever gone through his diary and noted that he went to a Catholic church mass. I mean, nobody had written that before. I like, and he always had a very, very tenuous relationship with what we would call evangelicals. Sort of the Great Awakening had come through, the revitalized Christians, and the Christian zealots of any sort. And one little episode of the book, and then I want to take your questions, and I don't even know what time it is because I can't. Oh, it's about time for me. Let me read this one passage. I had said he'd gone to the frontier, remember, and the first place he'd gone, the tenants wouldn't pay him, and the second place, he wouldn't pay him the right amount, and they were chiseling him, and the third place he couldn't get to at all, but the middle place was this place, his area at Miller's Run, where it had been settled by these religious fundamentalists. And I'm just going to read a little passage to show his dealings with them. They were called Cedars. A foretaste of the coming torment arrived while Washington was still with Simpson. Simpson was the guy who cheated him at the first place with the mill. It came in the form of cedars, S-E-C-E-D-R-S. Not like the tree, but cedars, from his 381-acre tract about 30 miles further west in Miller's Run. The American frontier always attracted more than its share of religious zealots, seeking their Zion in the howling wilderness. Members of one such band, the Cedars, a poor but earnest sect of Scotch-Irish Calvinists, had the misfortune of staking their claim to a frontier haven on land already claimed by the father of their country. Since they freely submitted themselves only to God, and Washington always insisted on controlling his land, a clash of wills ensued. Having known for decades that Washington claimed the land where they squatted, upon learning that he was on his way to assert his rights, they sent a delegation to deter and dissuade him. The Cedars, quote, came here to set out their pretensions, he underlined, Washington wrote in his diary about the initial meeting, and to inquire about my rights. But he saw through their pretense, and I'm quoting from, they really only wanted to discover all the flaws they could in my deed, he wrote. They saw themselves as called by Christ to Miller's Run, and would not submit to a landlord who did not share their religious beliefs. Named Cedars for good reason, they had seceded from ungodly society, while Washington typically said little in public about his personal religious faith beyond expressing a profound sense of divine providence. Close friends variously characterized it as anything from Episcopalian to deist. Nothing in that range would satisfy a Cedar. Still battling Simpson when the Cedars showed up, Washington was in no mood to extend Christian charity to a band of self-righteous freeloaders. They had caught him on a bad day, and with the matter unresolved, they would have to continue their conversation at Miller's Run. Washington reached Miller's Run by week's end, but put off meeting with the Cedars. Being Sunday, he wrote in his diary entry that questioned the religiosity of anyone who disregarded property rights, quote, and the people living on my land apparently, underlined, very religious, it thought it best to postpone going among them until tomorrow, that being Monday. He later characterized them, quote, in his diary as, quote, willful and obstinate sinners for preserving in their design to injure him. Inventorying the tract prior to the meeting, Washington identified 14 separate Cedar households and listed the buildings, fences, and acreage under cultivation by each. He's going around and seeing what they have before he confronts them head on. That's what he did on Sunday. He found these farms in better condition than those on his other tracts, which impressed him. When the two signs finally met on Monday, both asserted their rights to the land. Such conflicts were common on the frontier. At the time, claimants to undeveloped land could base their rights either on a government grant, survey, and some improvement, that'd be one way, or on occupancy, whichever happened first. So you could be a squatter, but not on land that had already been government grant, survey, and some improvement. Washington and most speculators used the former method, and the Cedars and many other frontiersmen used the latter. For the Miller's Run tract, Washington had purchased a warrant issued to a soldier in payment for service during the French and Indian War, then hired a local agent, William Crawford, that's the guy who was later roasted and eaten alive, to survey the land and in 1771, and to build a small cabin on it in 1772, this tiny little cabin. That was the improvement. Nobody lived there. The tract being otherwise empty, the Cedars moved onto it in 1773 and claimed the land by occupancy. They did it by, they built one of their houses so close to the little cabin, so they knew it had been claimed, that you couldn't open the door of the cabin. Crawford told Washington about them, but at least once the war began, he could do little about it. At the raucous confrontation on Monday, Washington insisted that the Cedars lease the land from him. They refused, but offered to pay a modest sum, quote, to avoid contention. Washington favored renting over selling of his frontier property because he wanted to oversee its development. In this, he acted the part of the traditional English country gentleman tending his estate. Some Virginians still followed this model, but it was giving way to the practice of buying, dividing, and selling frontier tracts. Washington dismissed the new approach as rank speculation and always denied being a speculator. As the Cedars recounted their hardship in clearing the land and explained their religious conviction against leasing it, that is, they principally didn't believe they could lease it from a heathen, who they thought Washington was, Washington softened somewhat. He offered to sell, but the sides could not agree on a fair price. Rather than pay much, the Cedars would fight the validity of Washington's warrant and survey in court. Barely able to control his temper, Washington called each out one by one and demanded that they individually declare whether they would accept his offer to buy or see him at trial. If he thought some might yield, then he underestimated the collective mindset of this sect. Washington wrote, "They severally answered that they meant to stand suit. Local legend has him emitting an oath," that is, saying a profanity, when they did this, "for which they fined him." One of the Cedars' children later recalled him dangling a silk cloth by a corner and taunted them, "Gentlemen, I will have this land just as surely as I now have this handkerchief." Washington devoted considerable time over the next 2 years to assembling evidence to substantiate his warrant and surveying his tract. Both were shaky. In the end, thanks to a good lawyer, Washington won the case, and the Cedars moved on with the frontier. It didn't hurt that the judge hearing the case, Thomas McKean, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a close friend of Washington. Well, that's sort of the stories I was able to uncover, and I'm willing to talk about more about the convention. I know we're running through time, but this is a Washington people don't get to see when they see the Washington as presidency and as generalship. The sociable, the political, the conversational, the human Washington. And I think if you see him as a human being, you get a much better appreciation for him. So let me take any questions if you have, and somebody's got to watch the time.
Well, I know that in New York, like in St. Paul's Chapel, I know there's a pew there that they have, like, it's not fenced off, but it's like a, a court around it.
Right.
I know I always had the impression, because I was there a whole bunch of times, that Washington went to St. Paul's fairly regularly.
When he was president, but remember, Think back. Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, went to church every Sunday too. Yeah, he went to church. He, in fact, went to a Baptist church every Sunday when he was president. And so when Washington was president, not when he was a general, when he was general commander-in-chief, I mean, you know, there was very little religion in the Revolutionary Army. But when he was president, he went to church, but he always left before communion, which is I've never seen anybody write that before. But he always left before communion. His wife stayed for communion, but he did not stay for. But he did go to church. He went to church when he was in New York. That was part of. He did believe in civic religion. That is, that religion can be. The government shouldn't support religion in any way. That he didn't, and he wanted to open it up to diverse religious beliefs or his own, which were more Unitarian, I'd say. I personally would view him more as Unitarian than a deist, but he certainly wasn't a Christian at this time. But he had this pew, and he did the same thing in Philadelphia where he would sit. But he didn't go all the time, but when he went, that would be the pew he'd use. And then Martha went more often. But he didn't stay because he principally didn't think he could take it. Yeah.
Did he have any personal contact with Jews?
Oh yeah, he wrote that famous letter to the Jews.
Yeah, but I know that. But I mean, in terms of like, personal contact.
Oh yeah, he did. He had he had some in high positions. Sure. Yeah, he did. He had personal contact, and during the Revolution, he had contact with the Jews. Absolutely. Sure. And with people, and his dear friend, I mean, Gouverneur Morris was the one person who was critical at the Constitutional Convention, critical in the early days of the Republic, who would have been an atheist. And Washington, they were best friends. And Washington would always go fishing with him during the Constitutional Convention. They would always go out fishing. Gouverneur Morris had the fastest carriage in Philadelphia. He was very wealthy, from a New York family. He lived in Philadelphia then. He was a Pennsylvania delegate. And he had this carriage that would go like the wind. And so they'd hook up Washington's horses. Washington had the strongest horses. And they would sail out, and they would go out fishing out in the Delaware River or up in the runs up in Valley Forge. They were very close. And Gouverneur Morris said that Washington once sent a note to Thomas Jefferson saying, you know, Washington believed just what we believe. Now, I think Thomas Jefferson by that time was more Unitarian, more religious than Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris was about the funniest guy in the world. He told the greatest stories. He had a wooden leg that he lost in a carriage accident, but he always told different stories. Like, he'd tell stories how he lost it. Like, he had been ambassador to France during the later part, and that he was leaping after. He had lots of mistresses, and he leaping. The husband came